Hi everyone, welcome to today's Coastal Resilience Network webinar series. My name is Dan Hosfeld. I'm the coordinator for the California Coastal Resilience Network. I'm the Sea Grant Fellow for the Coastal Conservancy's Climate Ready program. The Coastal Resilience Network promotes knowledge exchange through monthly webinars on climate-induced impacts on human communities and coastal habitats. I know many of you probably heard about us and this webinar through different avenues, so I'll provide our link in the follow-up email that you'll get at the end of the webinar. I also encourage you to follow that link and check out our past topics and join the network. It's free. Today we're hosting Point Blue Conservation Science, the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and the County of Marin for the release of their Sea Level Rise Adaptation Framework. You're going to hear from Maya Hayden, the Coastal Adaptation Program Leader at Point Blue, Julie Beagle, the Deputy Program Director of the Resilient Landscapes Program at SFEI, Jack Liebster, Planning Manager for the County of Marin's Community Development Agency, and Chris Choo, the Principal Watershed Planner for Marin County's Department of Public Works. As a reminder for how the GoToWebinar interface works, if you have a question, you can navigate to the questions box and type it in at any point throughout the talk. We will also ask you for questions towards the end. We'll have a Q&A. I will read your questions aloud and our speakers will respond. Please aim your questions towards one of the speakers, but if you don't, we will just ask it to the panelist group. And you're also welcome to follow up with more questions as they come up. We'll also follow up after the webinar with a recording of today's webinar and slides. So with that, let's get started. I'll hand it over to Maya Hayden.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to the Coastal Resilience Network for hosting us today. We are excited to share our recently completed Sea Level Rise Adaptation Framework, which, as Dan mentioned, is the result of a collaborative effort between Point Blue, SFEI, and the County of Marin, with funding from the Marin Community Foundation and the Coastal Conservancy. Thanks to Dan for introducing today's speakers. I'm just going to give you a kind of a quick overview of where we're headed today. So Jack Liebster from Marin County is going to provide some background and local context, sort of a history of where the project evolved from. Then Julie and I are going to tag team an overview of the adaptation framework process with the case study examples from Marin. And Chris is going to close us out with talking about the application of the framework process, and we'll sort of collectively chime in with next steps. And then, as Dan mentioned, we'll have some time at the end for questions. So please, do feel free to type those in as we go. And take it away, Jack.
Thank you, Maya. Marin County started its Ocean Coast Sea Level Rise program in 2013 when there were few models available to follow. This is a new kind of planning for local governments. While we've regularly incorporated aspects of science into our planning, addressing climate change took that to a whole new level. A typical general plan tries to visualize the next 20 years, but here our planning horizon is 80 to 100 years and even more. Additionally, the systems we need to respond to are in rapid and even accelerating change, and the magnitude and timing of that change is highly uncertain. And early on, it became acutely clear that our present governmental systems are inadequate to managing change that doesn't respect city, county, and other jurisdictional boundaries. And the next slide. We quickly had to form new partnerships. For example, the crucial involvement of the USGS and its absolutely indispensable Coastal Storm and Modeling System, or COSMOS, and with Point Blue, who gave us the tools to handle all that data. And we recognize that any kind of solution would require the awareness, understanding, participation, and support of a wide range of people and organizations who will be affected by and who can help us respond to rising seas. So we work to identify the built and natural assets that would be impacted at various different levels of sea level rise and storm activity, and the nature of the risks that pose to them. Those are described in detail in our vulnerability assessments for the ocean and bay shorelines. Next slide, please. So obviously the next question is, what can we do about these risks? We did research the state-of-the-art for adaptation measures, including both the more traditional engineering response and a whole new class of evolving approaches variously called green or soft or nature-based. The adaptation report we published about a year ago cataloged those and where they might potentially be applied on the coast, but not specifically developing individual actions for individual locations. Our overall criteria for adaptation evaluation includes the 4 factors here: effectiveness, environmental consequences, economic considerations, and provisions for equity. We recognized we needed a systematic way to evaluate, select, and apply the best adaptation alternative to each of the multiple sea level rise impacts we had identified, and specifically with regard to nature-based options, which we had very little experience with. That's when we approached Point Blue Conservation Science and the San Francisco Estuary Institute to partner in a proposal that was ultimately funded by the Coastal Conservancy and the Marin Community Foundation to provide a framework for moving to the next stage. And that's what we're going to present here today. Take it away.
Thanks, Jack. This is Maya. So as Jack provided, I think a lot of communities, Marin is no exception, are potentially at this transition point and are facing this transition between vulnerability assessment and developing adaptation solutions. There's also a lot of interest in nature-based options, but not so much familiarity with where they might actually be most appropriate. And then finally, there's a lot of existing guidance and resources that we wanted to leverage and pull together. So just want to pause and emphasize why our particular project is focused on nature-based measures. And part of that is because these nature-based measures provide more than just coastal protection. They provide multiple benefits, from wildlife habitat benefits to recreational opportunities to water quality improvements, not just providing a single function. They also tend to be more adaptable over time, right? They're natural systems. They can evolve with changes in environmental conditions through time. They tend to be cost-effective, particularly over the long term. However, as Jack mentioned, they're less familiar to many, and there's also less technical guidance out there on where and when they are appropriate or suitable. So what we're emphasizing here is to prioritize these nature-based measures where they match the problem and where they can be supported by appropriate environmental conditions. So prioritize them where suitable. And we're also emphasizing that in developing a comprehensive shoreline adaptation strategy, these nature-based measures can be used in combination with a host of other approaches, from green hybrid strategies to the traditional gray infrastructure solutions, as well as non-structural policy measures. And then just a quick note about terminology. Jack mentioned we're sort of using these terms interchangeably, but for our purposes, we've been referring to these as natural or nature-based measures. A lot of people call them living shorelines or green or natural infrastructure. The other piece is we wanted to, build on existing adaptation planning approaches. So when we get to the actual steps of the framework, they should be very familiar to you. They're also consistent with developing guidance. So for example, the state of California is currently updating its adaptation planning guidance. It's called APG 2.0. And our framework will likely sit very nicely within that phase 3 that they're developing. There are also lots of regional guidance or approaches. In the San Francisco Bay Area, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission has an Adapting to Rising Tides program, and they're also in the midst of updating their plan step, which is where this framework can also help to support. So what's new, what we're adding with this framework is to consider an alternative scale for planning, what we'll talk about as these operational landscape units or nature's jurisdictions, to prioritize nature-based measures where they are suitable, because they do provide those multiple benefits, and so to transparently consider those benefits as well as trade-offs among different strategy approaches. So the ultimate goal of the project was really to develop a framework process and a set of tools to support the transition from vulnerability assessment to adaptation strategies at a useful scale.
Hi, this is Julie from SFEI, and we need that useful scale because we know that sea level rise isn't going to stop at city boundaries. We see really sobering examples of that already. As most of you know, this is an example of a highway that crosses the northern part of San Francisco Bay, Highway 37. It was closed for 6 weeks in the winter of 2017. And this highlights the need to figure out how to work together. What is that scale? This is an image of that same road, crosses 3 counties, a national wildlife refuge, some of our largest and most important tidal marshes in the Bay, and is a path of travel for many commuters. So part of our work has been trying to propose a useful scale for adaptation planning, thinking outside the box. And we've essentially proposed a new planning unit. We've called them operational landscape units. And we think that these are areas with shared geophysical and land use characteristics that may be particularly well suited to a suite of nature-based strategies. They are connected hydrologically, so these tie to watersheds, and they include all the land potentially inundated by sea level rise under the H++ scenario under the newest OPC guidelines. And these units are really asking people to work together within their watersheds or tidal sheds, where something that you do in one part of the OLU is likely to affect another part. We know that if each project, each landowner, each individual jurisdiction goes it alone, we risk exacerbating flooding effects on some communities while protecting others, both within operational landscape units and also across the Bay. So we define these units based on their geologic and geomorphic setting within San Francisco Bay. Essentially, how does the slope of the land meet the water? To help analyze opportunities for nature-based approaches. So these are things like separating areas with steep headlands, or like in this picture, where steep headlands meet steep water. This is an example from Marin County that would create a different set of opportunities than, for example, a wide alluvial valley like this with more shallow water, more space for tidal marshes to form. And we've defined 30 of those operational landscape units in a report called the San Francisco Bay Adaptation Atlas that we released in May of this year. And the framework that we're discussing today really builds upon that work and puts it into practice in Marin County.
Thanks, Julie. This is Maya again. So now we have these natural boundaries within which to conduct our planning process. And this is just an overview of our framework. So it starts with that traditional vulnerability assessment, moves into identifying adaptation measures that work well in a given place, and to use nature as much as you can. There's a sort of a visioning step. What are desired outcomes and the goals of a particular strategy, so that we can then put together the variety of adaptation measures into some kind of coherent strategy that we develop for each desired future. And then finally, to evaluate and prioritize the benefits and potential trade-offs among alternative strategies that we may have. the key piece here is that although we've sort of, we've set up the framework in this kind of stepwise linear fashion, it really is intended to be both adaptable and iterative. So we had a lot of conversations about, doing the visioning process before identifying adaptation measures. There's more detailed information in the user guide about how you could potentially mix up these steps. And it also really is intended to be iterative. And then underlying the whole framework process is the assumption that this would be part of a broader stakeholder engagement process throughout, that's really foundational to the framework itself.
So it's Julie again from SFEI. So as Jack mentioned at the beginning and Maya just talked about, Marin County and others throughout the state have completed really thorough vulnerability assessments. So we took those vulnerability assessments and teased apart the sources of the vulnerability as a way to get towards suitability. So we're all used to seeing blue on maps and considering if you're in the blue or out of the blue, but to get to how to pair adaptation strategies, we really need to understand why you're in the blue part of the map. We need to understand the sources. And in San Francisco Bay, that really depends. In some places, your vulnerability can be from overtopping of berms, as shown here in a large storm event. So this is a kind of classic berm that we have here, unengineered with rubble, can easily be overtopped and will be more overtopped as sea levels rise. Riverine flooding is another source, the flooding that comes around the back. This is a creek capturing a downtown in a big storm event. We also have king tide flooding, which, as everyone knows, is getting more and more prevalent, will be our new normal. And not pictured is groundwater flooding. So we have it coming from all directions. So we created maps from the vulnerability assessment that really were trying to look, how did I go back, towards the source of the vulnerability. And teasing apart that in each operational landscape unit, looking at the sources. So in this example, it's combined flooding and subsided areas behind levees and eroding shorelines, and then looking at the assets that were in the way, at risk and in the way. The work of this project was also really looking at suitability of nature-based strategies. And so step 2 was about identifying those. Through work here and in the Adaptation Atlas, we took a selection of nature-based measures, so there's many more that are possible, but here we looked at a range from subtidal all the way up through the watersheds that are suitable and applicable in San Francisco Bay. And for each measure, we mapped the spatial suitability, and some examples are shown here for each intervention, but also we also mapped how big they need to be, how wide, how high in the tidal frame would a feature need to be to do a certain job, for example, like knocking down waves. And then we created a suitability matrix for each operational landscape unit. So along the left, in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see the OLUs that are in Marin County, and along the top are the nature-based strategies. And a black circle indicates that it's likely to be suitable in that unit, but an open circle suggests that it may not be as suitable. Now, this isn't a menu, this is just sort of guidance, filtering down the range of opportunities that may likely to be suitable in that area. So along with the spatial considerations, for each measure, we also described other things like ecosystem functions they provide, what coastal risks they can help mitigate, and some of the policy considerations that go along with them. I'll give one example of how we did the spatial mapping. This is for marsh restoration. And so here, we identified areas that were at the right elevations today to potentially support tidal marshes. And then we assessed the width of the marsh needed to knock down waves based on the wave condition and the bathymetry in those areas. And so here's what that winds up looking like in a given operational landscape unit. So this is the Novato OLU. It's in northern Marin County. This is where those where tidal marshes are existing and also likely to be suitable given their elevation and the metrics that I described before. This is where polder management or dikes, subsided areas that we're going to need to treat separately exist. Also in purple, you see ecotone levees or horizontal levees shown in a picture on the bottom. So this is sort of the idea here is that not all things can go everywhere and that we need some range of opportunity to help us make these decisions. In yellow, you see areas that are not currently at tidal marsh elevation, but that will be. And in orange, you see that same level of elevation, but that aren't protected. And so it starts to get towards opportunities for potentially buying land or prioritizing different land use choices as the century progresses. Before I hand this back to Maya, I just want to make a note that this is not an adaptation plan. It's a suitability map. And so you wouldn't necessarily do all these things. This is just what you could do given the elevations of today and what we're likely to see in the future. And so the idea now is to match the measures as defined here with the specific vulnerabilities that we discovered in step 1 with a particular goal or desired future in mind for your shoreline. And that's what Maya's going to talk about.
Thanks, Julie. So step 3 really is that visioning kind of exercise. What are the desired futures? How can we articulate these visions for the future? Because a strategy, as we're defining it, is really a combination of individual adaptation measures within this landscape unit. And in order to put those puzzle pieces together, you really need some kind of distinguishing vision with some specific goals or criteria and a planning time horizon to put the pieces together. And then clearly this is a very obvious step where stakeholder engagement is going to be key. So what we did for the purposes of basically illustrating how to step through the framework process was we developed some kind of hypothetical visions and then a couple of case studies where we actually built some strategies. But these, again, are just examples to illustrate the point. They are not anything that the County of Marin is planning to do. So, for example, the first vision might be holding the line. And so our criteria here are that we want to build up our existing defenses and we want to employ nature-based options bayward of the existing first line of defense. So if you'll remember, we had this suitability map in the Novato landscape unit where, these are potential options given the present day elevations. But if we're constrained by our hold the line vision, then you can see that we really have opportunities for nature-based strategies that are limited to those bayward of the existing line of shoreline defense, which is the black dashed line. And so in this case, we're really, focusing on maintaining and enhancing the existing marshes that front the levee system and are providing those additional protective benefits. We might consider other enhancements to the front of those marshes, but the main strategy here is going to be elevating or improving the existing levee alignment. If we had a second vision that we can call buffer with public open space. So in this example, we want to keep existing people and infrastructure protected in place, but we're going to allow a retreat of the first line of defense on public open space land. And what that retreat does is it allows more space for additional nature-based options. So again, in the Novato example, that may be basically pulling the first line of defense back and creating ecotone levees, these kind of hybrid strategy approaches that then, are moving back. And then the green areas then become areas that we can restore to tidal action and can support, a host of other benefits. A final example might be, maybe in this vision, we want to maximize opportunities for habitat enhancement, while at the same time keeping people and homes in place. But in this case, we're going to allow that key infrastructure can be realigned or redesigned to accommodate flooding. And so again, going back to Novato, the main thing there might be actually elevating this highway to allow for increased tidal exchange into these other low-lying areas back here. Again, we're still going to protect some key places where there are homes with our ecotone levee slopes. And you can see then that there's this just much greater opportunity for returning areas back to tidal action in this particular strategy. Okay, so we've thought about, potentially how to lay this out spatially, how to sort of put the pieces together in space. But the other component to think about is time, because we know sea levels are rising, that these are going to be changing, the conditions are going to be changing through time. And so one of the things that we tried to highlight in the user's guide was, how do objectives potentially change with sea level rise? And how might our adaptation strategies themselves, how long might they last, basically, given sea level rise? And so we can use these models of marsh accretion basically just as a tool to think about how we might project changes in these strategies through time. And so, for instance, if we start with the kind of current configuration of the landscape, and then we say, well, if we restore by 2030 and we open up these areas to tidal action by 2030, if we assume some amount of sedimentation that's happening through time along with sea level rise, we might project that we're starting to get the green areas, these low marsh, so that's vegetated marsh, developing by 2070, and that actually could be maintained potentially by the end of the century. However, if for some reason the restoration of those areas is delayed until 2050, then you can start to see the consequences to our habitat objectives potentially, where they're low-lying. At this point in 2050, the projections are that the rate of sea level rise is rapidly increasing. We can get to maybe mudflat elevations, and those are maintained by 2100. And so there's a distinction, and that's not to say that mudflat is bad. Mudflats provide all kinds of benefits. The point here is just that we want to make sure that we're having kind of realistic objectives in a particular time horizon, and that some of these strategies are going to change and shift through time. So the final step is really around evaluating and prioritizing these strategies. We may have now kind of alternatives that we've developed, and the key step here is then identifying benefits and services that are important to stakeholders. And so we point to resources for thinking about ecosystem services, as well as the traditional cost considerations. So thinking about things related to ease of permitting, construction and maintenance, but also biodiversity support services, our habitat and wildlife values, cultural and social services, anything from recreation to specific services to disadvantaged communities or vulnerable populations. And the next piece then is to measure these in some way. In order to measure these in some way, we have to identify some indicators of these benefits that we care about. And so again, in the user guide, we point to resources for developing those, and these can be quantitative or qualitative. And they could be, things like, for cost, the amount of fill material that might be needed to build, for instance, an ecotone levee, because we know more fill is going to equate to higher cost. It could be other things like the total miles of trails for an indicator of recreational benefits. The indicators themselves can be defined by the community. And once you've measured those indicators, then you can really start to look at trade-offs among strategies. And this is just kind of one, again, example of how you might visualize or present this type of information. But the idea here is, say in this instance, we have 4 particular benefits that are key to some area. A biodiversity support benefit might be, the area of tidal wetlands by 2070, projected by 2070. A recreational metric might be, total miles of trails. A cost consideration could be, again, the amount of fill. And the idea here is that you can set these up in this kind of relative space such that the higher values mean more benefit. And that allows you to see, to compare total benefits by looking at the area of each of these polygons, kind of gives you a sense of the cumulative benefits, but you're still able to see the individual trade-offs among benefits and among strategies. The other piece here is that you can weight certain benefits more than others. So that might be particularly helpful where there are issues of equity involved. But the bottom line really is that this type of trade-off assessment really helps to support an informed choice among adaptation strategies, and in fact, more likely may lead to developing alternative strategies that combine elements from the ones that you've originally developed.
Thanks, Maya. It's Julie again. So we have a couple lessons learned, and then we're going to talk about how some of these ideas are being used in San Francisco Bay and then specifically in Marin County. We all know this, but it's worth repeating that there's no one-size-fits-all for sea level rise adaptation. In some places, there's a lot of options for nature-based measures, and other places there aren't. And most of the time, these are going to be hybrid green to gray solutions. And it's really important to also keep in mind how these options change with sea level rise and over time. Developing those adaptation pathways, which we're just starting to get to in these scenarios, and with the modeling that Maya talked about, is really important because timing matters so much and our options really change. And then finally, we did these exercises, we created these scenarios with Marin County staff really as a way to demonstrate the use, how these tools could be used. But to really do this, it needs to be done with communities, led by communities, with a really large stakeholder process, because each of the choices that Maya talked about, each of the choices and how they change really depends on what the community values and what the county or city or whichever cross-jurisdictional group is working on it. It has been really heartening and fascinating to see how these types of conversations are starting to take place both in San Francisco Bay and around the state. These types of tools have, and I hope will continue to be really useful for bringing stakeholders together around a given shoreline unit. What are the groups of people that need to be in the room to talk about adaptation pathways and how to transition from vulnerability into adaptation? These tools have also been helpful for environmental review and permitting, and also for developers and project applicants. And so everybody can use the same guidance moving forward and getting these projects in the ground, which is ultimately our goal. How do we get projects in the ground that help adapt our shoreline and our areas to sea level rise? And next, Chris Choo is going to talk about how regional and county governments can use these in this type of adaptation planning process that we're all moving towards. So I'll turn it over to Chris.
Thank you. So Marin County is really going to utilize this framework to demonstrate the applicability of our nature-based options for sea level rise adaptation. You saw the data behind the work is really impressive. It gives our community tools to evaluate the level of protection that they want, habitat goals, and others over time for sea level rise, given kind of a range of strategies that are palatable for kind of the nature-based options, and considers their willingness in terms of making room on our shoreline to adapt. And so those key components are big in terms of thinking about the realistic guidance that's needed for sea level rise adaptation. And this is really for us a direct response to public desire to use the nature-based options first, fund them with the grants that are available, and to start acting now and in terms of getting to that resilience. And the framework really supports this with the data and the work that went in behind the scenes. Some of the gaps that are exposed with this is really around that intersection of the green and gray, the nature-based and the hard engineering options. And so those were really outside of the scope of this grant, which wanted us to look at the nature-based. But moving forward, this is really going to be one of our next steps, is looking at how we start to evaluate the limits of what can be done given the willingness to want to stay in place or to protect certain things in place. And so this also really does help us with discussions around retreat and how we plan for that, how we manage that as a community, and then how and where it makes sense to do that based on what our collective desires are for the landscape. And then immediately, this is really being used, you saw, for some of the examples along Highway 37 to help support planning on Highway 37. And it'll really go through the more robust community engagement and outreach effort with the Town of Corte Madeira's Climate Adaptation Plan, which is really looking at sea level rise and fire risk, and will be released next year. Going back to Maya.
Thanks, Chris. So the sort of big picture next steps are that we're really interested in translating this framework for broader application. The OLU concept and the framework approach itself, we had always intended it to be scalable. So we're really interested in transferring the framework, sort of workshopping it in other locations to test and modify it for that broader applicability. In particular, we've been talking about, how it might be modified for the higher energy outer coast environment. We did develop this and a lot of the resources specifically for the San Francisco Bay. And then the other piece that Chris highlighted was, how do we think about evaluating strategies that combine green, hybrid, and gray measures together? So at this stage, we're developing funding and partnerships. And if you are interested in how this framework might apply in your area, please feel free to reach out. We would love to hear from people as we are kind of actively developing where to go next. So with that, thank you very much. Our user guide is available at the URL here below, and you can contact each of the speakers if their emails are listed. I wanted to also thank the Marin Community Foundation and the Coastal Conservancy for providing the support for this particular project. And as is always the case, the 4 speakers on the webinar today are just representing a much broader team from Point Blue, SFEI, Marin County, and the Coastal Conservancy. So just wanted to acknowledge our broader team. On behalf of our collaborative groups, thank you so much, and I think we'll pass it back to Dan for questions.
Great, thanks. Okay, so we do have some questions that have come in during the talk, but to our attendees, now's a good time to get your questions in to us into the questions pane so we can keep the discussion going here. We should have a lot of time for questions here, so if you have them, bring them in. So our first question here, can someone please update on the status of nature-based strategies bayward of existing defenses and the classification of those by BCDC as fill? Are there certain NBSs that we need to stay away from because BCDC is still changing how they categorize fill?
That's a great question. This is Maya. And my understanding is that they just recently passed a Bay Plan amendment, but I'm wondering if maybe Julie might know more about this.
Yeah, just 2 weeks ago, BCDC passed a Bay Plan amendment called Fill for Habitat, or that's the short name for it. And I think we all should congratulate them. It was a really big process of trying to evaluate when and how some guidance around what types of fill for beneficial uses could be suitable for sea level rise adaptation. I don't know much of the specifics, or I will refer you to BCDC themselves. They have a lot of documentation online. All to say, we were working really closely with them through the Adaptation Atlas work and also this work, because what we are proposing traditionally has been considered bay fill. The Water Board, who also funded the Adaptation Atlas and has been a big partner, is also undergoing policy review for their beneficial uses policies, and they will be coming out with a report any day now, which is kind of moving in the direction of allowing in certain places under certain conditions some of these nature-based strategies. I don't think there's some that we necessarily need to stay away from, and I think it's a really good step that both BCDC and the Water Board are moving in that direction to allow things like beaches, mudflood augmentation, horizontal levees, things that haven't particularly been easy to permit, moving those forward. The other thing to note is that there is something called the BRIT, which I won't try to tell you what that stands for, you probably know, but it's the group of the resource agencies who are all sitting together, the Army Corps, Fish and Wildlife, California Fish and Game, BCDC, the Water Board, and I'm probably forgetting some, who are trying to streamline permitting for these types of projects, make it easier to get nature-based adaptation measures in the ground as soon as possible, because we know we don't have enough time. So I think there are some really good movements on that front in the agency world.
Great, thanks. We have another question here. Can you please describe the thinking behind developing the vision and outcomes after identifying strategies and suitability? For community engagement and buy-in in the process, collectively identifying the vision may typically come first. Is there an advantage to doing that after identifying strategies as this framework lays out?
This is exactly the conversation that we've had lots and lots of times, and and which is why we think the whole thing is iterative. I think there's a lot of answers to this question. One answer, and then I'll let Maya weigh in, is that it's really important to set guiding principles and goals up front. When you go ahead and set your vision up front without understanding suitability, you run the risk of wanting to put a marsh off the coast of San Francisco because you want that, not because it's actually suitable. And so that's why we think of step 2 and 3 as really iterative. Figuring out goals and visions is really important, but also checking that with what is just physically possible, and making sure that's an active part of any decision-making stakeholder process. Otherwise, we see lots of designs and beautiful renderings of shorelines that just the hydrodynamics don't allow for that. And so I think that was our reason for doing it first in this case, but it definitely is iterative.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. I think just one quick thing to add is part of our rationale for setting it up was because we were focused on the nature-based options, and that those are less familiar to many folks. So the idea was to sort of I guess, elevate people's understanding about the potential opportunities for nature-based options, because if they immediately went to sort of visioning, they may not even consider those as a tool in the toolbox at that stage. But again, as Julie mentioned, I think it can go either way.
All right, our next question here ties back a bit to the BCDC discussion that we had. Because there are current urban areas which are adjacent to the bay and difficult to retreat, do you think there are opportunities to fill in areas of the bay to support habitat restoration?
That is a tough question. I'm not sure if any of our other panelists have thoughts about that.
I understand the question. I don't think we are not proposing filling the bay for making new habitat. I feel pretty confident saying that. The idea was to work within the processes that formed natural systems historically, how they work now, and how we think they're going to work into the future. So, and I think our approach is more where are the elevations for tidal, for example, for tidal marsh now? They're not in the middle of the bay. They're not where there are mudflats. They tend to be either where we have marshes or in low-lying areas that we have developed for different reasons. So it's not proposing making the bay is getting bigger. That is what is happening, and we don't want to fight that. And so the philosophy behind this type of work is really working with the natural processes, waves, sediment supply, tidal range, projecting how we think that's going to change and work with that as opposed to fighting against it. So I don't know if that answers the question or if anyone else wants to add anything.
This is Chris, and just to add a little bit more to that, I mean, I think what this really helps us do, and I think this kind of goes back to the last question as well, is it really does set some guidance based on data, based on, you know, the flow of water, the depths of the bay, and tries to put some of the considerations out front. And certainly this framework didn't look at options for filling what's currently open water or even parts of the bay, but I think part of what this helps folks understand are the types of considerations that would have to go into something like that. And so while we're not promoting filling the bay, I think what this does is help folks understand the distinction between creating habitat for the sake of possibly creating habitat and using that same habitat for sea level rise protection, and seeing that both over time and kind of along the OLU. So that operational landscape unit, it's worth going to the Adaptation Atlas and really kind of digging in all the different considerations that went into developing the operational landscape unit, because it does go into the subtidal areas, into the areas that are wet. And so looking at all those different options and then looking to see what we can really do and how those nature-based options really function for sea level rise protection. And I think that's a big distinction from just thinking about creating habitat where we want. And so it does sort of start to lay out some of the available data as well as the limitations.
Great, thanks, Chris. This next question is for you as well. Has Marin County's Department of Public Works discussed integration of the adaptation framework here with Caltrans as part of the project on Highway 37?
And this might be something where Sam or Maya might have a little bit of input, but it's certainly been used in talking about Highway 37. I think we're still really early in that process. And so the slides that you saw during the talk sort of highlighted the options that have already been laid out and talked about some of the benefits in terms of habitat, in terms of protection, and kind of what would be needed in order to expand that habitat, to maximize it, or to utilize Highway 37 the way it's currently laid out, which is basically a levee. And so I think this is being brought in as we do that planning process. It's also being brought in with Caltrans on 2 other grants in the county, which include the Corte Madera shoreline as well as the Richardson Bay kind of southern Marin shoreline. And so it's definitely being used and talked about as we think about what our adaptation approaches look like.
Yeah, and this is Sam Veloz with Point Blue. I'll just add that, yeah, we shared the framework with the team that's working on the Marin County portion of Highway 37, and they're interested in looking forward to talking with us more about it. But as Chris said, it's kind of early stages of the project, so we'll have to wait and see how that progresses.
Great, thanks. So on to our next question here. This is for the group, I think. Is it possible to operationalize OLUs in local comprehensive plans or ordinances, or will they have to be implemented at a regional voluntary scale to be effective? Are local zoning plans or regulations a priority or not, given the regional scale of the OLUs?
That is the question. Sorry, Maya, go ahead. That is essentially the question, but Jack, why don't you take that?
Yeah, thank you. The OLUs by no means replace traditional zoning or any of those kind of land use controls. What they do is they give you an idea of how independent jurisdictions within that OLU are in fact not independent, but affect one another. And that information, that understanding is what you want to integrate into your land use planning. And if you're looking at zoning and standards for development, then it informs that process. And so I think they go along hand in hand.
Great. Our next question here. Can you speak more about how it appears the pathways of adaptation will work in this framework as the progression of sea level rise within the very wide range of possibilities proceeds?
Sure. I mean, I think part of what we are trying to emphasize is to think about those potential thresholds, which is where, some of the modeling and projections of change can help to support that kind of decision making in terms of, okay, what are some trigger points for a particular area that we should be thinking about, and what elements of our adaptation strategy need to be in place, at that particular trigger point time. So I think what we're hoping is that this framework can actually help to support that kind of thinking about adaptation pathways and developing those adaptation pathways by thinking not just about how you fit the measures together sort of spatially, across jurisdictional boundaries, but also how those measures are potentially going to evolve through time.
This is Jack, and I just want to reemphasize this. It's not going to be easy to do this. We're looking for people who are very adept at four-dimensional chess to take on these challenges, because you do have the 3 dimensions of space and the just as important 4th dimension of time as it goes forward. So you have to fit together things, not just now, but in the future, and have that adaptation pathway, that flow of consecutive actions that hopefully will not require or will minimize the redoing of actions as you move forward in time.
And one more quick thing to add thanks Jack, that we perhaps didn't emphasize so well is that when we're thinking about putting adaptation strategies together, it's not necessarily that every measure is going to be implemented at once, at the same time, simultaneously across the landscape unit, but that perhaps part of the planning is thinking about the appropriate way of phasing different measures through time to achieve those, kind of target visions or objectives.
All right, next question here. Based on the multi-criteria assessment on one of the slides, does a nature-based measure within this framework have to provide some level of coastal protection? Or would you consider a measure even if it does not provide any coastal protection benefit?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think from my perspective, the measures themselves are put together to achieve some kind of objective, right? And so I think having wetland habitat as an objective is totally valid given the context within which we're working, and that perhaps that wetland habitat needs to be put together in conjunction with some sort of traditional levee system behind it, providing that flood protection benefit if that is in fact a vulnerability in a particular location. So I think what we're trying to emphasize is that you can combine these things, and that's again where that third step is really important, that visioning step. What are the benefits that people value in a particular location and want to see going forward? So I do feel like, you could end up putting in a measure in a particular place that's nature-based that may not be providing a coastal protective benefit, but that is providing a host of other benefits, and that you may be addressing your flood vulnerability in a different way.
Thanks, Maya. I just want to add that I agree with what Maya's saying, but want to note that the way we assigned suitability for the nature-based measures, for most of them did have a coastal protection component. So not only was it about their elevation and location in the landscape, but about using literature, the most up-to-date literature, to define kind of how a tidal marsh breaks waves and how wide it needs to be to knock down waves to a reasonable depth. And we did the same for beaches, for ecotone levees, for migration space, and a lot of the work that's gone into monitoring eelgrass and oysters, that was incorporated. So again, one of these measures is not going to solve all problems in all places or even in one place, but that was a major consideration for how we determined suitability.
I'll just add that in the framework document itself, in the guidance report, the Novato example that we showed that was used during this webinar, that's approximately 1,200 acres that we have that's owned by the county of Marin. But in the other case study in Corte Madera, it's a much smaller area, and so you can sort of see the benefits that while they definitely do have a shoreline protection or a community protection component to them, you can see the places where we have a lot more room and where a lot more of that is maybe, especially for a period of time, possibly mostly for the benefit of habitat, but with kind of a long-term look at that ecotone levee that will eventually have to be put in place to protect the home or the road behind it. But there's potentially some time there where you can just restore the wetland, knowing that this later step will have to include additional measures for that borderline area with the community itself.
Great, thanks everyone. We have a quick announcement here. We had a BCDC staffer chime in. There's been a lot of talk about BCDC, so this is coming straight from BCDC themselves. We welcome anyone starting this process to come in and speak with the permitting staff. We have a pre-application process that does not require fees. Thank you for that input. That is very timely, much appreciated. So our next question for our Marin County folks, can you share a little about how you will use this framework to jump into community conversations about shifting land uses and the potential for retreat?
I think part of that, it's obviously something that we're really early in here in Marin County, but I think part of this is kind of a bigger conversation around the limits of what we can do using the nature-based options. So I think for this community in particular, that is really the first choice. And I think starting to understand that there are limits to what you can do and maybe limits to where you can put some of these features. The Bay Area has been very excited about the horizontal or ecotone levee for quite a few years now, but I think starting to understand that just can't be applied anywhere on your shoreline is a good first step. And so that really does sort of naturally lead us to the harder engineering options and the trade-offs with that. And so, what kind of catastrophic risk do you want to place your community in if you build a wall right at the bay edge? What are the other options? And so I think what this framework does is give us some stepwise options. If we do maybe retreat a small portion, perhaps these benefits could be realized through a nature-based approach. And you saw that during the webinar, kind of just the different iterative options in terms of how much space we want to protect. So that might be one way we can use it. And I don't know, Jack, if you have additional thoughts.
Yeah, I think the visioning process is very important here. And as both Julia and Maya mentioned, the iterative nature of that, a lot of the difficult work that we face is getting the totality of the people that are going to be affected to really understand and appreciate that there, at some point, there are not options that can protect those resources indefinitely with sea level continuing to rise. So I think we have to be empathetic to the quandary that people who are affected by this face, because aside from moving into an area or buying into an area like that, they didn't create the problem that they're facing. And that's why that process of engagement with people, where people learn to come to understand the dynamics, what's possible, what's not possible, and what other opportunities there are beyond that particular location that they're in, is going to be very, very critical, because nature bats last, and there's no way you're going to change that.
Great, thank you all. So we're at 1 p.m. We've hit the hour mark here, and we do have a few more questions, but to those question askers who we haven't gotten to, you can expect that we'll follow up with you individually just to clear up anything there. There are a few site-specific questions that we'll have our experts get to. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today and sharing your expertise on this exciting new framework. Obviously, a lot of interest because we've had too many questions to answer in our hour period. So thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to all the attendees for tuning in. As we mentioned at the top of the hour, we'll follow up with a recording of today's presentation and some slides. And to those of you who we haven't gotten to, we'll follow up with you individually. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day.